Okay, so we've created our virtual environment and we've installed Django in it. Now it's time for us to start creating our Django project. Unfortunately, before we start, I need to go into something that I'd hoped we didn't need to cover, but I ran into so many issues that it's necessary to go over this. So I was hoping that we could run this whole tutorial just using Git Bash, and that was to provide a simple, consistent user experience for you, where you only had to learn about one terminal. Unfortunately, some of the Windows commands that we want to run, or rather some of the Django commands that we want to run using Windows, only work properly, it seems, in PowerShell or CMD, and it was just too much trouble to get them to work in Git Bash. So we'll still be using Git Bash for some bash scripting to use SCP and to use SSH, but we will be using PowerShell for our local Django development to run the server and do local Django commands. Just as a quick tour of your command line options in Windows, you've got CMD, which is the old school terminal shell, and CMD is, as far as I can tell, basically in Windows only for backwards compatibility reasons, and it kind of sucks, so I'm just going to get rid of it and never speak about it again. PowerShell is the modern Windows command line tool, and it's okay. I use it sometimes. It would be better if it supported things like SSH and SCP, and we're just going to use it for some local development. And that's okay. It's just a bit of a pain that you've got to get used to using two different terminals. And of course, Git Bash is a sort of stripped down version of the bash shell, which comes with Linux and has some tools that we want to use. So that's why we're going to keep using it for a bit. Now, rather than juggling these two different windows, and in particular this hideous blue one, I'm going to use a tool called conemu, which is just basically a box. Yeah, it's basically just a nice green box that hosts other terminals. So you can see it's running PowerShell right now. And it's exactly the same as this PowerShell, it's just in a nicer interface. So I'll be using this. You don't have to. If you like it, you can go and install conemu, like the bird. But you don't have to. You can just go ahead and use the Git Bash, which we installed earlier, and the PowerShell that comes installed with Windows. The one thing I want to point out to you is that when you run PowerShell, just make sure you right-click on it and go Run as Administrator. If you don't, you'll find you'll get some permission errors occasionally. And the second thing with PowerShell, this is a PowerShell terminal still, it's just a different color, is when you first open it, if you've never used it before, you have to do this weird thing where they make you basically set a permission for yourself. You need to grant yourself access to run scripts, even if you're an administrator. And I think this is a security feature that they put in just to make it so like random users don't get told over Facebook to run some script which lets some hacker control their computer. So the thing we need to write is set x tab, set execution policy with -ex execution policy bypass. And what this does, it basically just lets you run scripts on your computer, which is usually just like a default thing that most terminals will let you do, but PowerShell really makes you work for it. So there you go. Stop it. All right. Okay, with that out of the way, let's move on with our Django setup. So we're in C users matd, which is where we were before in Git Bash, and let's move into our project directory to code Django Deploy. And we can still use ls in PowerShell. You can see we've got our environment, our requirements.txt. Let's activate our virtual environment. Activating our virtual env in PowerShell is slightly different to doing it in Git Bash, but it's mostly similar. You do /env scripts activate, and in this case we want activate ps1. So this is a just a different script. It's a PowerShell script, and we can cat it to look at the contents. So it's written in the PowerShell scripting language, and it does the same thing as activate did in Git Bash. So let's run that. You can see we've got our little env thing. We can do git command pip, which is like which, but in PowerShell you can see it's pip and it's in C users mat code, blah, blah, blah. You can do a pip freeze. You can see we've got Django and all the stuff that Django needs. So we're back where we were before we got into this mess. So we have the Django admin command, and let's run Django admin, see what it does. You'll see it has the start project command, which we'll use to create our project. So let's do Django admin start project. We'll call our project shoot. There you go, it's created a project for us. If we have a look inside, you can see there's the manage py script, which we use to do sort of some basic Django things like migrations and creating users and stuff like that. And inside of our Chute application, which is inside the Chute project, we have our WSGI file, which we'll need for later, URLs, which define the URLs for our project, settings, which define all the settings. ASCII is used for some stuff that we don't care about right now, so we are going to just get rid of that for simplicity's sake. Right, so when you use Start Project to create a Django project, it's already sort of a functioning Django web app. We can run it, and to do that, we're going to use Python. I know we've got to go into the Chute folder first to get to the management script. There's the management script there, and we're going to run Python manage py migrate. And this is going to use all of the default Django database migrations and create a database for us with all the migrations in there. So it's going to set up all the admin tables, the auth tables, the content tables inside of our database, which is this db.sqlite3. So this is all good. This is great. One little problem, small problem, is that this database file is inside of our project. And this is fine for local development. But when we deploy this app, we want to deploy this whole Chute folder. And when you deploy a web app, you don't want to deploy the database. You typically have a database in your local development environment and a separate database in production, right? And so we don't want this to get dragged along. And so just for convenience sake, we're going to make a little settings change to put this outside of the project folder. So I'm going to delete our brand new database, open up our Chute app, go into settings, and you'll see there's this database setting sort of configuration here. You'll see it sets the name of our default database to the base directory, which is the Chute project folder, plus the name of the file db.sqlite3. So we're just going to change this to the folder that is above the base directory. And we can do that with some OS path manipulation. So we're going to make parent dir, it's just a name I made up, os.path.dir name, which gets the parent directory name, and we're just going to apply that to base dir, and then we'll apply base dir with parent dir, and that's it. Just a little bit of settings manipulation to make sure that our local database gets created in the right place. So we run the migrations again, and there we go. It's outside of the Chute folder. Cool. And another little thing just for our local development, we want to create a super user. You might notice that when I'm in PowerShell, I need to prepend my Python scripts with Python, and that's because PowerShell doesn't know how to interpret these as Python scripts. It needs to be told to run them with Python. So we're going to run manage py create super user. So because this is a local database and it will never get deployed, we can just give some bullshit username and password. Password for me is going to be 12345. 12345, and Django is going to say this is a bullshit password that you shouldn't use, and I'm going to say I don't care, this is for local development, so it doesn't matter. And there's my user created. Cool. Now we're ready to just run our server, make sure it's all working. So that's our run server logs. That's good. And we can go to localhost 8000. And you can see our Django app's working. We're getting the HTTP requests coming through. We made a get to the root path, which is this. and we've got a 200 response, which means good. And you can also see a bunch of static files have been requested by my browser as well, and returned by the server too. We can go into the Django admin and just log in and make sure that all works. Cool, all good. So our site is sort of working. Now let's start customizing it. So we're just going to do a very bare bones setup here. We're not going to do anything super fancy because the point of this tutorial isn't really to teach you how to make a nice Django app. It's teaching you how to deploy a basic Django app. So let's start by adding an application. So we've got our sort of central app, which is concerned with like the settings, the URLs and all that stuff. And let's just make another one. But a cool trick, if you do have ConEmu installed, you can press Control Tile to make it sort of pop up and down without having to sort of touch the mouse, which is pretty cool. So we're in Tute, we've got the management command, and we want to use manage.py start app, and we're going to call it counter, and you'll see why it's called counter in a second. So you can see it's added a counter app in here. And there's counter app. We're not going to write any tests for this. Tests are great, but not today. And we're going to start by adding a view. So I'm just going to type the code in, but we are going to say from Django.hdp import response. We're going to make a view called index. It's going to take request. I'm just going to return an HTTP response with the text. This works. So it's the most basic view you could possibly write. And in our tutorial app, we're going to, in the URLs, delete all this crap because it's ugly. We're just going to say from counter.import views, and then we're going to make a new path. And it will be the sort of the root or slash path, but Django likes it if you just make it an empty string. And we're going to use index. And I think that all worked. Python manage.py one server. Yep, it's running. And you can see I've opened a new PowerShell window here. I'm just using a shortcut. It's a nice thing about ConEmu, you get multiple tabs on the same screen. And I'll just make sure I've activated the virtual environment again. Cool. Let's try out our new view. Cool, this works. That's nice. It's nice to just check that your app is working. Now let us add a model. This is going to be a pretty dumb model. It's just going to be a counter. So this is the dumbest, sort of most simple model I could imagine, where it just counts. All it does is has one integer on it called count, and it is the only field. Okay, so that is our basic model. Now we need to tell the root Tute app to come and look for this model. So we need to go into settings, and we've got to add our counter app to the installed apps, and that looks something like this. From counter, we're going to look at the apps module and look at the counter config class to define the application. Right, and with that now we can, you can see at some point run server shut the bed when I was doing that, but we'll get it working again. Now we can run. Oh, we've got to go into the cheap folder. So we're in the same folder as the management script. All right, now we can run make migrations. If you're not following, what I'm doing now is I've defined a model. And the reason we want a model is because when we deploy our app, we want to make sure that we're like testing the database as well. We're not just deploying an app that does something dumb like returns a string, because that's not very interesting and it doesn't really represent everything that Django can do. So I've put a database model in, so we can sort of use that to test our app. And I'm now going to make a migration, which is a script which Django will run to set up the database for our model. So models here, I've told our Django app about this sort of model and its application in the settings. And now I'm going to go into our management sort of script and tell it to make migrations. And there's no module named counter.app. Oh, right. Well, yeah, I screwed up. We may as well figure out what's happening here. So there's no module named counter.app. So I've told Django to look in the counter folder and find a module called app, which I don't know, seems right to me, right? But if we have a look, the thing in the counter folder that we wanted to refer to is in fact called apps with an S. So I have made a basic programming error and forgotten the S, which is probably why it crashed before. So let's try again. Boink. Name model is not defined. Once again, in my hurry to write code, I have written model.integer field instead of models.integer field, which maybe shows why you shouldn't write code in a rush. Let's try again. Oh, it worked. So you can see it's created a file called 0001 initial for my model counter, and this is just some Python. Go away. This is just some Python that we in fact could write if we wanted to. Put it in the migrations folder, called it that. And so yeah, it's really just auto-generated some Python code, and you can write your own migrations if you want. It's just easier to let Django do it for you. Unfortunately, the migration that's been created, or maybe fortunately actually, has not been applied to the database yet. It's just a script. That's all we've done. We've gotten Django to write this script for us. So the next step is to actually create the database tables required to host our model. So we're going to use the migrate command for that, which takes all outstanding migrations and runs them. And you can see it's just added our counter initial migration and applied the changes that we want to our SQLite database. All good. So now that we've done that, we can use our model. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go into the views and we're going to just do something really dumb. And so the reason that we're doing something dumb rather than something clever is because I'm trying to make this very simple, because the point of this is not to create a fancy Django app, it's to test the deployment. So what we're going to do is we're going to get the last counter that was created from the database, and if there wasn't a counter in the database, we're going to create a counter. Great. Right, so no matter what, at this point in the code, we will have a counter, whether it already existed or we had to create one. And then we're going to increment the count field by 1. Then we're going to save that. And then we're going to marshal some context. Actually, no, let's just, instead of getting too fancy yet, let's just do it in a string. So let's say count is counter.count. I think that will work. So every time someone sends us a GET request, our Django app will pull the counter from the database, add 1 to the count, save that to the database, and then return the current count to us. This is not good practice in Django. Generally, GET requests, which is just when you load a page, should not change the database state, but I don't care about that right now. So let us run our Django app. We run server, And it works. Beautiful. And let's have a look. You son of a bitch. Oh yeah, that's because I got rid of that import because I was rushing. Okay. Right, so I guess this is a good time to point out that while we have debug equals true, which is like a default setting in Django when you create it, you get these nice error messages, which is great. I immediately saw that. I saw HTTP response and I thought, that's what I fucked up. So this is very useful for local development. The problem is that it tells the user who's looking at this page all sorts of stuff about the Django code. It tells us about the Python path and where the code is from, where the Python executable is, the Python version. It's got all sorts of information here. And this is not information you want to give out to the general public because it makes the job of hacking your website much easier. So this is why later on we will set the debug setting to false. And that's just a bit of context for you. Yep, it's running now. Let's give it another try. Count is 2. Okay, let's just ignore that it wasn't 1. Count is 3, count is 4, count is 5, count is 6. We can see our GET request going through. Nice. It's all working fine. Now, we're not done yet. Our Django app is like 60% done, but there's some more features we need to add to really make sure that our deployment is sort of testing everything that we care to test. So another thing that we want to make sure we implement are static files. And that's because, as we will see, deploying static files fucking sucks, and it needs to be included in this guide for it to be sort of a complete guide. So we need to add a HTML template, which is why we'll use render. So you might be familiar with render from the Django tutorial. It's just a shortcut to help you create HTML templates. And we're going to get our template from counter index, which we will create in a second. And we'll whack some context in there. That context will just be the count, which, as we know, is counter.count. That's all good. So this will break our view for a second because we don't have any templates yet. So by convention, according to Django, you're supposed to do this. You want to make a folder called templates. And then for some fucking crazy reason, they also want you to, inside of templates, create a folder called counter again. And I'm sure the Django developers will have a good reason for this, but it seems pretty bizarre to me. So in there, we're going to create our index.html file. So now just looking at the path, we've got our counter app. In our counter app, we've created a templates folder. In our templates folder, we've created another folder called counter, which is what Django tutorial tells you to do. So cool. And then we've got our index file. And this is going to be pretty basic. It's just going to be an HTML thing. And then we're going to have a body. In our body, we're going to have div. In our div, we're going to have an h1. And it's going to say hello world. Exclamation marks. I'm feeling pretty excited. And then just the count is count. That's it. We've just inserted our variable from our context into our template, and otherwise it's a pretty boring Django template. Right, I think this will work. Let's give it a try. Hello world, the count is blank. Oh, you're kidding me. Counter, counter, count. All right. Hello world, the count is 10, 11, 12. It just keeps going. Isn't that exciting? Cool. So one more thing to do, and that is to add some styling. And the reason we're adding styling is to show you some issues that crop up later. So this will all work in our local development, but when we get to deploying it to prod, you'll see that our static assets, which are things like JavaScript, CSS, images and logos and stuff, will have issues when you just try to deploy them without doing some configuration first. And so we want to sort of simulate that issue by adding a static asset. So the Django convention is to add a static folder in your app, and once again do a weird thing where you create a folder called the name of the app again inside, and then I'm going to add a style.css. Right, I've sort of prepared some nice CSS just because I like to show off. So I'm just going to type that now. I'm copying this over the screen, by the way. I'm not typing this all off the top of my dome. That would be insane. Cool. All right, sorry to bore you with that, but that's our CSS done. And now we need to import our CSS from our static folder into our template. And we are going to use Django's templating sort of language to do that, because it would be silly not to. And I suggest you use the Django templating tools rather than trying to hard code your own paths. So we're loading the static module, and then we're going to add a head to our HTML document. In our head, we're going to add a link thing. I'm going to say the relationship of this link is that it is a style sheet. We're going to say the type of style sheet is text CSS. I don't know what other type it could possibly be, but apparently browsers want to hear that. And our href, or the path of this link, is going to be templated in as static counter. I don't know why you've got to do the different quotes, little quotes. Counter style dot CSS. I'm going to get rid of that quote because it's fucking me up. Cool, I think that's it. And let's have a look. It hasn't loaded my CSS. All right, so look, this is as good an opportunity as any to go over some basic debugging. So my website's not working. What the fuck? I put a style sheet in. This should work. Like, I'm pissed. How can we figure out what's going wrong? Well, let's start at the browser. Is my browser asking the server for the CSS? And there are two ways we can figure that out. One is by looking at the HTML. Well, you can see that the style sheet is in the HTML. And this means that the browser will, in fact, be asking for it. And we can go a step further. We can use the inspect tool, and we can have a look at the network panel. You can see already there's this little red cross, which indicates that some sort of error is happening, which is sort of good in a sense, because it means that, like, we're perceiving that something is going wrong and the browser agrees that something is going wrong. And you can see that it has failed to load a resource. And if we go into the network tab and we rerun it, you will see that styles.css has failed to load with a status of 404, which means not found. And I can't believe it. I've done it again. Look at the name, styles, and this file is called style. So I have just messed up the S. It's killing me. So I need to change. Oh, and we can sort of verify this by looking at the HTML and having a look, and it looks at styles. We can also try and open it in the browser, and Django says page not found. You're an idiot. Cool. So we can change the name, or change the name. Something's got to change. Cool. Let's try again. And oh, come on. All right, so now the question is, what the hell? It's still not working. This is insane. So it's asking for styles.css. That's, I guess, good because we didn't change that. And we'll try rerunning it, look at the network request, and our Django app still can't find styles.css. I suspect that we have to restart our run server program for it to like find this new file, styles. And so I'm going to do that. I'm going to stop it and start again. And by the way, you can see as well the GET request. So we had a look at the browser side that it was failing to find the style sheet with a 404 status code, which means not found. You can also see this in the run server output, which is a good thing to check. Let's stop it. Let's start it. It started. That's nice. Let's run it again. Please work. Yes. Okay. We've got a nice style sheet working. It's obvious that it's working because it doesn't look like shit. And we can also just verify that by seeing that there are no nasty errors. If we go into our network tab, we can see our... Well, actually, this is as good a time as any to tell you about caching as well. You can see when I'm loading this now, it's loading my style sheet with a 304, meaning not modified. It means it's actually not reloading it. It's recognized that this is something that's worth caching, and it's actually not asking the server for it. You can see there again, 304. So the actual content is not being transferred over the wire anymore. But if you do a shift or control click on the refresh thing, instead, oh, go away, you'll get a 200 again. So basically, the first request for the style sheet, we get the style sheet, 200. The second request, oh, why have you changed now? Oh, look, we'll go over this later, forget it. But we can also see the contents of the style sheet now coming through. That was annoying. Great. So we now have our model installed. We've run the migrations. We've done all of that stuff. And the last thing we want to do before we finish up with this, actually second last thing, is to set up our admin panel. This is very straightforward. This just will allow us to look at our model when it's deployed from the admin panel rather than having to dig into like a console thing. It's just a nice thing to set up when you're deploying your code. So let's deploy the counter. We'll do admin.site.register. I just looked this up. I don't have this memorized. Counter, and that is all you need to do, which is nice. And finally, we can check localhost admin, login. I think we're already logged in as our super user, and it cannot connect for some reason, probably because I crashed it again. Yeah, didn't like that. Oh, yep, rushing, always. So I've told, oh, Jesus, I really butchered this one. So there are two problems with this. First of all, it should be from the counter app dot modules, import the counter model. Has Django recovered? Yes, that's good. And we can reload this now. All right, and you can see our counters are in there. There should only be one. There should only ever be one with the way we've written our code. And you can see the count is 27. And if we visit localhost again, it will increment the count up to 28, which is nice. Cool. All working, all sane. The final thing I want to show you before we move on is, yes, it's problem with PowerShell. Its output is gross. Is how to access your Django models from the shell, and we'll be using this potentially later for some debugging. And we can just do it with manage.py. So if we do manage.py shell, you get the Django shell, which is just a Python environment with which is a little nicer, I guess. And you can import from your Django app. So from counter.modules import counter. And this is covered in the Django tutorial, but I just thought it'd be good to cover it again. So we can pull things out of the database. We can assign it to variables. We can look inside, look at the count. We can delete stuff. I exit with Control Z usually. And you can see we've deleted our counter and it's back to 1. Cool. That's it. Our Django app is set up for local development, and usually you would spend some time in this mode just getting all your features ready, all the basic stuff with your views and your models, and that's all we've really covered in this section. In the next section, we'll be covering how to actually set up your Django application for deployment, and we'll be getting into production settings and some of that more interesting stuff.